Hello and welcome to Artificial Intelligence in the Public Sector, Election Security, and AI, the fifth episode for our third season, produced by GovExec TV in partnership with the National Academy of Public Administration and ACT-IAC, the American Council for Technology Industry Advisory Council. I'm your host, George Jackson. The 2024 elections concluded relatively smoothly, but they also stressed the growing importance of identifying threats, managing misinformation, and supporting electoral integrity. What did America learn about the pivotal role AI will play in securing the democratic process? Let's find out. Here now, John Gilligan, President and CEO of the Center for Internet Security. He's also former CIO for the Departments of the Air Force and Energy. John, always great to see you, sir.
George, thanks for having us. I really appreciate it.
His colleague, John Cohen, Executive Director for Countering Hybrid Threats at CIS. Mr. Cohen is also former Acting Undersecretary for the Office of Intelligence and Analysis at DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. John, welcome.
It's nice to be with you today.
And joining us remotely, Marci Andino, Vice President of Elections Infrastructure in CIS's Information Sharing and Analysis Center, former State Election Director for South Carolina. Marci, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today.
So, John, kick us off. For those who don't know CIS, give us a bit of a table setter. What is the center? What kind of work do you cover? How do you touch election security?
Sure. George, thanks. The Center for Internet Security is a mid-sized nonprofit organization formed in 2000, so we're in our 25th year. The center was formed to focus on best practices, developing best practices through a collaborative means. And so we have hundreds of volunteers across the world who work with us to identify best practices. Our two primary best practices are first, configuration settings to make off-the-shelf products more secure. We call these benchmarks. We have about 200 of those. And the second is a set of security controls, which are prioritized and measurable, and we publish those, and those are used. In addition to the best practices, we have a set of tools that complement and allow organizations to better utilize these best practices. In 2010, CIS integrated the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the Multi-State ISAC, that had been formed in New York State. And we have been able to work with the state, local, tribal, and territorial organizations now to grow that organization to over 18,000 organizations. And so what we provide is network and endpoint monitoring. We provide threat notifications. We provide incident support, training, as well as sharing of best practices. In 2018, really building on the multi-state ISAC success, we were asked to form the Elections Infrastructure ISAC. And so that was really as a result of the 2016 attempts by foreign actors, Russia, to get into election systems. So Marci Andino heads that for us, and that has grown fairly significantly, where we now have approximately half of the elections offices that are participating in the what we call the EI ISAC. More recently, in 2022, the organization, working with John Cohen, who was at that time leaving the Department of Homeland Security, we decided to expand our focus to what we're now calling the hybrid threats. And so John's organization was formed. He joined us to focus on looking at threats that are not just cyber, but are in many cases a combination of cyber, physical, and information operations. And John will talk about that. And so as we got prepared for the election, what we were able to do is leverage both the EI ISAC that Marci heads and John Cohen's Countering Hybrid Threats program to be able to work with elections offices, law enforcement, public safety officials, to be able to help them prepare for the elections.
Well, let's talk specifically for a moment, John, about 2024, November. Huge buildup, something akin maybe to Y2K years ago, as you know well. Major concerns, then poof, pretty much nothing. Did we worry ourselves to death for nothing? Did people do a great job galvanizing around election security? What did we learn from November 2024?
Well, George, I think what we learned is that the efforts to prepare that started many years ago, the elections officials, and more recently with elections officials, law enforcement, were successful. I mean, that's the main takeaway. The fact that there was nothing significant is really, I view that with much pride as I look at our organization and others and what they had done to prepare. So it's not that nothing happened, it's that those events, cyber, physical attacks, information operations, organizations were prepared. And so if you look back at the evolution in 2016, we really had very minor disruption, but you recall we spent many years post 2016 sort of analyzing that, agonizing that. We learned, and so we've dramatically improved the cybersecurity of the elections offices. The elections community has done a great job, and the EI-ISAC has helped. In 2020, the big issue was mis and disinformation, and that caused a lot of controversy and in many cases, controversy internally. As we then moved to 2024, there was much progress made in the cyber protection, much progress made in how to deal with mis and disinformation. So the elections officials were out in front and were communicating with the public before the mis and disinformation to sort of ensure that the trusted voices were able to be heard. And I think the big change then what we saw in 2024 was the rise of physical threats and the bomb threats in particular, but not just bomb threats, it was swatting, et cetera. And I think I'm particularly proud of the work that, John Cohen's team, working with Marci's team, working with the elections officials and law enforcement did to prepare them to be able to handle this situation so that John can talk more detail, but, over 100 bomb threats right around elections and virtually no disruption of voting, which one would not have conceived of that if that had happened years ago. That would have shut down the voting in those locations. There would have been, a lot of controversy about why weren't we prepared, et cetera. But as you say, it sort of turned out to be nothing, but it's a huge success.
John Cohen?
Yeah, I would describe 2024 and the election as an election that took place in what has been described as, at least I've described publicly, as the most complex, dynamic, and dangerous threat environment I've experienced in the 40 plus years that I've worked in law enforcement, homeland security, and national security. About a year before the election day, CIS's analytic team worked closely with state and local law enforcement officials, the intelligence community, and others to develop a threat assessment. We focused on the potential for physical threats directed at election officials, candidates, other government officials, law enforcement. We focused on potential for cyber threats directed at state and local government systems and those related to the election. We focused on information operations that were potentially intended to undermine confidence in the results of the election or disrupt the election process. And we focused in on the types of disruptive events John was just talking about, bomb threats, swatting calls, white powder envelopes that could be employed by foreign and domestic threat actors seeking to disrupt or interfere with the election on election day. And you know what? Every single one of those threat activities occurred. We had targeted attacks directed at election officials and in particular a presidential candidate who was targeted for assassination twice. The FBI and Secret Service disrupted multiple plots targeting candidates as well as government officials. We had sustained levels of cyber activity directed at state and local government information systems. We had information operations, and we had online content, some of it AI generated, being pushed out into the ecosystem by foreign intelligence services. And as John mentioned, in the lead up to the election, we had election offices being targeted with swatting calls and white powder envelope situations. On election day itself, we had over 100 unique locations, polling sites targeted with bomb threats, a number of them part of a coordinated effort that originated overseas. What was also different about this election season, as John said, was the level of preparedness. Again, in the 40-plus years I've been doing this, I've never seen state and local election officials and law enforcement working as closely together as they were to understand the threats facing our local communities, to prepare for those threats, to plan for those threats. And so while we had, for example, these 100 locations that were targeted, there were no significant disruptions to voting at any of those locations.
You mentioned, John, a lot of the stakeholders already. One that hasn't come up yet is CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They had a little bit of, I'll call it muscle memory this time around from the 2020 election. Could you talk a little bit about, what credit CISA specifically deserves in securing that election for 2024?
I think CISA has done a good job through their protective security advisors, their cybersecurity advisors, their election security advisors, making available resources to state and local governments so they can enhance their cybersecurity posture, so that they can conduct physical threat assessments and risk assessments to facilities associated with the election. This was an all hands on deck effort. CISA certainly was at the table. FBI was certainly actively involved in helping to prepare local communities. But at the end of the day, the way the threat has evolved, it's really up to the state and local officials to be prepared to deal with whether it's a potential act of targeted violence or an AI-generated piece of content that's intended to shake people's confidence in the results of the election, which, by the way, we saw. We saw examples of both of those activities, and what we also experienced were state and local officials able to rapidly respond and deal with these situations.
Marci, John Cohen teed you up there, and I'd like to talk a bit about those elections officials at the state level. What are the threats that they're facing? How are those evolving, ma'am?
So there are threats and challenges with every election, and election officials, whether they're at the state level or the local level, they're great project managers. They're great planners. So a lot of what they do is plan for operational and logistical challenges, such as staffing and having enough equipment on hand and finding lots of locations for voting to take place. But they've also been introduced into the cyber world, and they're concerned about all types of cyber threats, as well as physical threats, and then election day disruptions, which turned out to be the big issue for the 2024 general election.
As all of you were talking, I am struck by how complicated it is to galvanize all those forces to the common goal of election security, John Gilligan. I was scribbling notes here while all of you were talking. I mean, IT professionals, cyber experts, elections officials, law enforcement, the list goes on and on. Some of those stakeholders weren't really at the table as little as 8 or 12 years ago. How has that changed the dynamic, the conversations, the sort of communication ecosystem that has to happen to make sure that an election is secure going forward?
Yeah, George, it's a good question. And so let me walk back. In 2016, we had the elections officials were primarily on their own, so to speak. And they were doing a good job, but they weren't coordinated, integrated, and they weren't getting a lot of support from outside. In 2018, with the creation of the Elections Infrastructure ISAC, and CISA taking a lead role in focusing on elections, we began to see coordination resources being flown, guidance, best practices, exercises that were made available. And so I think that was the start. Vulnerability assessments that then would let the elections offices be able to fix cybersecurity problems, and investment by Congress in intrusion detections and endpoint devices, et cetera. And so, and I remember vividly a discussion. We had one of the secretaries of state in 2018 that was making a comment, and they were asked, well, how is this coordination with the federal government going? And at that time, the comment was, well, it's about as good as you could expect in a forced marriage. And I think since then, though, the value of CISA, the value of the ISAC has continued to be appreciated by the elections officials, and there has been tremendous progress made. And so I think that's really one of the things that's happened. So that when John Cohen described in 2024 calendar year, Marci's team working with elections officials, John Cohen's team working with law enforcement, working with a number of other associations, CISA included, we were able to scale the bringing together of these various communities. We have exercises, we helped create materials that then could be used, but other organizations then convened. So state level folks convened all of their elections offices. Some other nonprofits helped in that area as well. So, I mean, it was really a challenge of first establishing the relationships, getting the trust, and then starting to scale, and then also responding to what we saw as the threats that are coming, not what happened in the last election.
Yeah, so it was really interesting, George. One of the things we did is we worked with groups like Major County Sheriffs Association, Major City Chiefs, National Sheriffs Association, and the election officials that Marci works with. And we facilitated and helped those local communities organize planning sessions that involved, as you pointed out, the head of cybersecurity for that county or that jurisdiction, the police chief, the fire chief, the emergency manager, people who on some occasions may sit together in cabinet meetings with the county executive or the mayor, but when planning for emergency situations, often do not sit there and talk to each other. So it was really interesting from my perspective, not to get too much into the weeds, but to hear a police chief and a fire chief talking to a cybersecurity official about unified incident command, and how if you were dealing with a situation that involved, an active shooter, a bomb threat at a polling site, and a cyber attack against the 911 center, how they would all work together in order to make sure that the voting could continue, the situation could be handled in a way that ensured the safety of the community, and they could overcome technical issues that may arise because of a denial of service attack or some other type of attack meant to take down the communication capabilities of law enforcement and first responders.
Marci, I'd love for you to pile on here a bit and talk about some of the lessons learned at the state and local level, but also I want to key in on one of the words that John Gilligan used, and that's resources. Say for 2026 congressional races, other future elections, what do state and local governments need from a resource perspective that they didn't have in 2024?
So as far as resources are concerned, if you talk to any election official, they're going to tell you they're under-resourced. They don't have funding for staffing to put cybersecurity protections in place in some cases, and then also to be able to recruit and train poll workers and have adequate resources for voting systems. So that's their big struggle. It's always been this struggle, and it's not uncommon for that to be at the state and the local level. But they are experts at, doing more with less. And, they collaborate and work with us as well as the other federal agencies. And, they make it work. And they've had to learn a lot along the way. about, how to do that. And in some cases, it's just really asking the right questions of their IT providers, because most of our members aren't responsible for their own networks. They have to rely on others to provide that infrastructure for them, and making them aware that we can help them by providing no-cost cybersecurity solutions. So planning's already underway for the 2026 elections. There'll be threats. We don't know what they are at this point. Other than the same ones that we continue to see, but we don't know what the theme will be for 2026 until we get closer. But I can assure you they're already providing or planning for whatever might arise.
As those people look, John Gilligan, to CIS as a resource, give me your shining example of 2024 election security, things done right. Is there a success story in that pantheon of things that you've investigated that really stands out in your mind?
Well, I'd go back to the point that John Cohen made. Our facilitation of the coordination between elections officials and law enforcement and other public safety organizations was transformational. That was something that just didn't exist, and in fact, few would have even conceived of that. Once you looked at the threat, as John said, in early of 2024, when we looked at the threat, we said that we need to have this coordination, and with a lot of help from other organizations. I say we sort of facilitated. We helped kick it off. We helped facilitate, but the various law enforcement associations, some other nonprofits working with the elections community, made that happen. In my view, that was just the scale of this. When you think that there's roughly 9,000 elections offices, and I don't know, John, how many law enforcement organizations? Many thousands. To get a large portion of those to have these types of sit-down exercises, in my view, was just a tremendous success.
What about the disruptors themselves, John Cohen? Has that changed from election to election? In 2024, were there new disruptors, people who are pushing misinformation and disinformation relative to the U.S. election at the table?
The threat environment we face today is dramatically different than the one we faced 10 years ago, and the threat we'll face in 2026 will continue to evolve. Going back to your earlier question, what do we need? It comes down to three things from my perspective: intelligence, intelligence, and intelligence. The threat facing the United States has, as I said, dramatically changed. We're seeing foreign and domestic threat actors. And when I use that term, I mean foreign intelligence services, foreign terrorist groups, domestic violent organizations, even criminal organizations. They have fully embraced the power of the internet. The tradecraft that they use to conduct all types of intelligence gathering activities, covert operations, violent attacks, depends on their ability to use internet-based communication tools, online communication tools. They're increasingly leveraging artificial intelligence, other advanced computing capabilities, even dabbling in quantum computing. When they're developing information operations, content they use in information operations, it's becoming more realistic. They can do it less expensively, and they can use these same technologies to push it out more broadly across the ecosystem more quickly. Makes it much more difficult to counteract those types of information operations when they are going viral before they're even detected by the intended target. So what it means is that we have to adapt investigatively from a threat mitigation perspective. And I think part of the challenge has been that government agencies, and I say this with love and affection, are not always able to operate outside of their stovepipes and are not always able to adapt quickly. We have a threat that's evolving at internet speed, and sometimes my friends and colleagues are still operating at analog speed. And that's where groups like, and this was a big surprise to me, quite frankly, because I've spent most of my career in government, and that is something that groups like CIS, Center for Internet Security, can really play an important role, because we can often operate more nimbly, more quickly, and we can adapt more rapidly to emerging threat scenarios. And what I hear repeatedly from my federal, state, and local law enforcement colleagues is that they can't do what we do as quickly as we do it. And that's why they've come to depend on the analysis that we on a day-to-day basis are providing them on a broad range of threat issues.
That speed element, John Gilligan, leads me back to the beginning of our conversation and the focus of this series specifically, and that's artificial intelligence. You know, we've talked on past programs in this series, past seasons of AI in the public sector, about AI as a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it can introduce new cybersecurity-based threats. On the other, it can be a force multiplier for organizations that need to move more effectively faster. How do you see it tee up artificial intelligence for us as applies to election security?
Yeah. So first I would focus on what we saw happen over the last year. And as John Cohen mentioned, we saw artificial intelligence really come into the main as a significant threat. And so there were just numerous and different modes and different uses of artificial intelligence that we saw. They weren't as good quality-wise, and so in many cases, the consuming public looked at them and said, wait a minute, I know this is not real. And there was preparation done because the elections officials, the federal government was in fact warning the public. But I think as we go forward, this is the big new threat that I see, is that, as John Cohen mentioned, the ability to generate more realistic and more rapid, more tailored attacks leveraging artificial intelligence tools is growing, and it's growing very quickly. And it's not something that the government is in a good position to be able to address. And it's not a criticism. It's just that the government has certain legal limitations on what it can do in terms of, monitoring or surveilling, or just, they have to have probable cause often before they're able to do that. And that's why what we found is we set up a shop where we got some tools and we were doing evaluations of what we were seeing. And we saw in really all different forms of artificial intelligence being used. And in some cases, we were able to then tip law enforcement and say, wait a minute, here's something that's going on over here. This looks like it's more than casual. This is a particular threat. And so I think the model that John Cohen is suggesting is that in many cases, I think it's Center for Internet Security, but other organizations who are able to operate much more rapidly, don't have the limitations of government. It's not that they're going to get into content moderation. They're not going to change content, but they're going to, when they see something, be able to inform appropriate law enforcement, who then can do their investigation and decide if it's something worth pursuing.
Marci, I want to hearken back to something that you said earlier relative to talent, recruiting the right information technology professionals to really tackle this issue. And I don't want this question to be interpreted as, people aren't incredibly dedicated or, smart at the state and local government level. I've covered local government for a number of years in my career. Some of the smartest, most talented people I've met were working at that level. But that talent gap that you mentioned is real. How do you address that relative to artificial intelligence, which advances at such a rapid clip? How do people keep up? Is it training? Is it more hiring-based authorities to bring top talent into state and local government? How do you start to tackle that?
That's a really good question. And election officials themselves have to wear many different hats and have many different core competencies. And of course, IT skills and cybersecurity are rapidly becoming part of that. In your small jurisdictions, they may not even have an IT person on staff. And I think that the EI-ISAC and the multi-state ISAC can help fill that void by providing lots of education and no-cost cybersecurity solutions so that we can help bridge those gaps. But it's a lot about education at every level. And artificial intelligence, it's here to stay. And it's something that everybody, I think, got a crash course in 2023 and 2024 in the buildup for the general election. That is the number one concern of election officials when they were going into and preparing for the general election, because that was, I like to call it, the new kid on the block. In 2022, we weren't talking about artificial intelligence. And, as John Gilligan alluded, there are good and there are bad, aspects to it or uses. And I'm looking forward to when we'll see benefits and we'll see systems improved in the election industry because of AI.
John Cohen?
I think it's also an issue of focus, right? We're really good in law enforcement in the analytic community at looking at something that happened in the past, look at something that happened yesterday, analyzing it, and then developing plans to address it from happening again. In today's environment, we have to look ahead. We have to, and that's sometimes is challenging for people in my profession. Think about the world through the eyes of, look at the world through the eyes of the adversary. Think about what they want to accomplish strategically and tactically, and then think in a forward-looking way about how that could materialize in a community or in a nation from a threat perspective. It's not about just dealing with the threats of yesterday. It's about dealing with the threats of tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year. The other challenge, I think, is that we still tend to view the digital world and the physical world as two separate environments. There's a professor from Rutgers University who said something, 10 years ago that really had an impact on me. He said, we used to think of the digital street as simply a reflection of that which occurs in the physical world. That is no longer the case. The digital street and the physical street are now intertwined. And what that means is that we can't think of cybersecurity and artificial intelligence as technology issues and crime and threats as something that law enforcement or the intelligence community deals with. They're now intertwined and now need to be looked at in a cohesive way.
Sure.
Yeah, I wanted to come back, George, to your point. Marci mentioned that as we move forward with the rapid advancement of artificial intelligence, that she was hoping that we see the benefit in terms of improved cybersecurity. And I think it's fair to say we're already seeing some of that benefit. We're not touting, we didn't describe it, but many of the tools that we're using, that we're providing, that are federally funded, that we're providing to state and local, have artificial intelligence capabilities built in. And I think that's going to continue. And so, as you alluded, we're a bit in a race, as we have been in cybersecurity for a long time, whereas the threat, in this case leveraging artificial intelligence, matures, we're also going to see defensive capabilities mature, leveraging artificial intelligence and the protection capabilities that you can get in the products that are available. And I think that's going to be a trend that we're going to continue to see over the next couple of years.
Marci, as we come to a close, I want to close with people. I mean, it's arguably this topic much more personal in Columbia, South Carolina, than it is in Washington, D.C. And the 2020 election, allegations of fraud associated with it, the sort of long tail of that discussion in U.S. political discourse has led to a lot of those local election officials simply leaving their posts. Is that a problem that continues today? Is it a big concern going forward, the people who are charged with really doing this at the ground level?
That is a great question. And yes, people are a key to conducting safe and secure elections. And what we saw in 2020 is the election environment turned hostile. And it turned hostile against election officials in some cases. And, these are our friends, our neighbors, our family members that are conducting elections. And they're out there working every day, around the clock in some cases, just to make sure that every eligible citizen has the opportunity to register and to vote. and to make sure that vote is cast and counted correctly. And it's personal to them, and they do their jobs without regard to political parties. And these threats of violence really struck home because it wasn't just against the election official, but it was against their families. And I think that was a real game changer. And when you add threats onto being resource challenged and just an overall lack of respect for the industry, that was very tough on election officials. And we saw a tremendous turnover since 2020. And that's a great loss of institutional knowledge. And there's really only one way to get the experience, and that is by conducting elections. And it takes more than one before you really understand all the moving pieces that go into conducting an election. So we made it through 2022 and 2024, and we've called both of those elections uneventful, and that's exactly how we like our elections. And, so I think the industry will continue to improve as election officials gain experience. But, it has been a tremendous learning curve.
John?
It just strikes me, your question strikes me with this thought. Marci's right. Every day across this country, there are volunteers and election officials, law enforcement officers who are out there in our communities each day trying to support and continue our core democratic principles, keep our communities safe. But I would also say that every day there are foreign intelligence services, terrorist groups, violent organizations here in the United States who are using the internet, increasingly looking toward artificial intelligence to support their efforts to sow discord, inspire violence, undermine confidence in our democratic principles, undermine confidence in our government institutions, and destabilize our nation. And they do this by spreading content online that is consumed and believed. So just as we have law enforcement and election officials who are working each day to keep our communities safe, all of us as members of the public have to do our part as well. And that means being thoughtful consumers of information that they're acquiring through online platforms.
Well, it's been a really amazing discussion with the big three of CIS, the Center for Internet Security, John Gilligan, John Cohen, and Marci Andino. Thanks all.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
And thank you, our audience, for tuning in. I hope you're as excited as I am to continue exploring AI in the public sector. For GovExec TV at our Watergate studios in Washington, D.C., I'm George Jackson. Have a great day.